and I certainly want to thank you all for organizing this and allowing us to talk about this today. And I want to thank everybody who's out there listening. This is going to be a little bit strange. Webinars are always hard. I normally start this talk by asking everybody in the audience to raise their hands if they've ever heard of ocean acidification before. So I'm assuming that some of you are raising your hands right now. But it's obviously a very growing issue, both in the science field within the agencies and also in the popular culture. People are starting to talk about this. News agencies are picking up on it, and the discussion is really broadening out quite a bit. And so I included this title, Is the Sky Really Falling? Not to be dramatic or provocative, but to really make sure that we understand both where we are in terms of the research and what the data is showing us in terms of the trends and how the different ocean systems and ecosystems are responding to the changes about ocean acidification. So as Jim said, I am a supervisor oceanographer in Seattle at PMEL, but I also still have very close connections to the Alaska Research Group, and we're still doing a number of activities up in Alaska, and I'm going to show you some very specific examples of that research today. So as we jump in, we can't really talk about ocean acidification without talking about carbon dioxide, because ocean acidification really is the sister problem to climate change that is also being driven by CO2. So if you look at some of these slides I have here, up on the top on the left-hand side, what I've got plotted is concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere going back to 2008. And these are taken at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And you see two things. The red data, the up and down cyclical cycle that you see, is just CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And what's really interesting about this is you can literally see the planet breathing. The northern hemisphere is where most of the terrestrial biomass is, and so in the summertime, the spring and summer, when the northern hemisphere is going through its maximum productivity season, you see those valleys in the red data and the red CO2 data. And then in the wintertime in the northern hemisphere, you see CO2 levels come back up. And so this cyclical movement of CO2 up and down really captures that productivity that's going on in the northern hemisphere. But overall, the black line shows you the trend of what CO2 levels are doing in the atmosphere on average. And you see very clearly that CO2 levels are going up. And so if you look down in the lower corner, I'm going to play a little video for you here. And what this shows you is that CO2 distribution in the atmosphere from the equator, which is plotted on the x-axis as 0, and then going into the northern latitudes, which is 1.0, and then down into the southern latitudes at the South Pole, which is -1. And the CO2 concentrations are shown on the y-axis here on the left-hand side. And this is going to start in 2007, and I'm going to play this forward. I'm sorry, this is going to start in 1995, and I'm going to play this forward. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you see the years and the months ticking by. And if you look at the right-hand side of the northern hemisphere, you see that bouncing up and down of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's that seasonal cycle of uptake in the northern hemisphere in the summertime and outgassing in the wintertime. And you see those concentrations moving back and forth. But I'll stop this right here for a second. If you notice down in the southern hemisphere, that's not occurring. We're not seeing that seasonal cycle. So it's like holding the end of a rope and popping the far end of it up and down. And the reason we're not seeing that cycle in the southern hemisphere is obviously because most of the terrestrial biomass that would be impacting those atmospheric CO2 levels just aren't present because the southern hemisphere is mostly ocean. But you can see very clearly, because there's no seasonal cycle down in the southern hemisphere, you see that very steady increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. And so now we're into 2006, and you see we're passing the 200 or 380 parts per million threshold, and this is where this particular animation stops, is in December of 2006. Where we are right now, in about February of 2013, is we're probably close to 394 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere today. And where we're headed by the year 2100, under current emission rates, really business as usual scenarios, by the end of this century, CO2 levels will be somewhere between 600 and 900 parts per million in the atmosphere. and I'm going to show you why throughout this talk that could be very important. But before we do that, we've got to figure out, number one, where all the CO2 is coming from and where it's ultimately ending up. There are two real repositories or sources of this CO2 that's ending up in the atmosphere that from human impacts, or what we call anthropogenic CO2. The first one, as you see in this panel on the left-hand side, is one that most people really don't think about, and that's deforestation. That's the loss of that terrestrial biomass that's taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during normal photosynthesis. And so because of the deforestation that's happened and is continuing to happen, we're losing that ability, or the terrestrial biosphere is losing about 1.5 petagrams of carbon per year in its uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. The other part, which is the much larger part, is our direct industrial emissions of carbon dioxide. And this is everything from electricity generation to automobiles. Anything that burns fossil fuels are releasing another 7.5 petagrams of carbon into the atmosphere every year. And so we have to add those two numbers together, and we wind up with a total of about 9 petagrams a year of carbon that are ending up in the atmosphere from anthropogenic sources. And just because, petagrams is a very difficult term to sort of wrap our minds around, I put a little key down at the bottom of the figure that 1 petagram is about 22 trillion pounds. And so remember, we're releasing 9 of those, and so 9 petagrams is the equivalent of putting about 99 billion small cars. That's the mass of carbon dioxide that we're actually putting into the atmosphere every year from these two anthropogenic sources. So if we switch over to the other side of the slide and see where this 9 petagrams of carbon is actually ending up, about 46% of it stays in the atmosphere. And that's what gives us, or that's what is giving us that increase in CO2 concentrations that we're observing in sites like Mauna Loa. That's why CO2 levels are going up. That's what's causing the warming to occur around the planet. About 30% of the CO2 is ultimately captured in the terrestrial biosphere, in that long-term biomass that we think about as being vegetation on the planet. And then the other 26%, the part of it that we're going to be most concerned with in this talk, is winding up in the oceans. And this is ocean acidification, that 2.3 petagrams of carbon that's being taken up by the ocean around the planet every year is what's leading to the changes that we're seeing in the marine chemistry. And we can very clearly demonstrate that this is going on. If we go back to near Hawaii, if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, I've got a little red triangle there where the Mauna Loa Observatory is, and so this is where the atmospheric CO2 data is coming from. And then north of the Hawaiian Islands, out in the Pacific Ocean, there's an oceanographic station called Station Aloha, where their routine measurements are made of CO2 in the seawater and also of pH in the seawater. And so what I've plotted for you here, the big colorful graph on the right-hand side of the slide, the top part of the graph, the red and the blue data, the red is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air from 1989 to 2009. And so you can, again, very clearly see the seasonal cycle of carbon dioxide as it goes up and down in the atmosphere in response to that biological productivity. But you see the very same trend, this very clear indication that carbon dioxide concentrations are going up from a starting value of about 340 parts per microatmospheres in 1989 all the way up to close to 380, which is where they were in 2009. And you see a very similar trend in the seawater CO2. So there's quite a bit more variability in the CO2 concentrations because there are natural processes at work that are overlying or ultimately providing some control on CO2 concentrations. But in general, you see the very same trend between the red line and the blue line. CO2 concentrations are going up in the ocean at pretty much the same rate that they're going up in the atmosphere. If you look down at the bottom data plot, the orange and the green data, this is scaled now on the pH scale over the same time period. And you see what happens is that there's a very definitive decrease in the pH. So it starts up around 8.12, and by the time we go through this couple of decades worth of data, we're down somewhere around 8.08. So there has been a very definitive decrease in pH. And if everybody remembers, the lower the pH, the more acidic the solution is becoming. And so while the ocean is not going to ever be acidic or have a value of less than 7, we are moving in that direction of lower pH. And I'll show you why. This slide is a very simple little schematic of what's going on with the chemistry when carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean. And it's a pretty straightforward reaction that very clearly demonstrates why the pH is actually going down. As carbon dioxide dissolves from the atmosphere down into the ocean, it immediately reacts with water to form this weak acid called carbonic acid, which is the H2CO3. And that weak acid immediately disassociates into bicarbonate, this HCO3-, and it gives off a hydrogen ion. And then that bicarbonate further disassociates down to carbonate, and it gives off another hydrogen ion. And so you can see that for every molecule of CO2 that gets absorbed by the ocean, it ends up giving off 2 hydrogen ions. And if you remember back to the definition of pH, pH is just a measure of the log of the concentration of that hydrogen ion. So the more hydrogen ion you have in the ocean, the lower the pH is going to become. So that's the pH story. That's what's ultimately reducing pH. But from an organism standpoint, what we're more concerned about is the loss of this carbonate in the ocean system. This reaction actually reduces the amount of carbonate that's available for organisms to use to either build or maintain their healthy shell. So this is everything from a coral reef to a clam to a tiny little pteropod. Those organisms need this carbonate, this CO3 2-, to maintain and support shell growth. So as CO2 concentrations increase, that carbonate ion concentration decreases. And ultimately, where we're headed and the impacts of what our additions of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are going to have, what I plotted here for you is some historical data. So the black line in this figure starts in the 1850s. We pick 1850 because it's really the start of the Industrial Revolution. This is when humans really started releasing significant amounts of anthropogenic carbon into the atmosphere, mainly because this is when fossil fuel became more prevalent in its use. And you can see over that sort of 100 to 200-year timeline, CO2 did decrease, but it wasn't decreasing at a very fast rate. It started up a little bit less than 8.2, and by the time we got to where we are today, we're down to an average pH of about 8.1 or a little less. So over that time, that's what's baked into the pie already. That's what we've done as a human species from the amount of fossil fuel and deforestation that we've done till this point. But there are two really things that can happen now in the future, and what we plotted here are two different scenarios. The RCP 2.6 assumed one set of emission scenarios. It assumed a great deal of reduction in carbon dioxide emissions that would start basically now, and obviously we didn't do that. So based on that scenario, pH would have only changed a total of about 0.13 pH units from where we started in 1850 to where we would have ended up in the year 2100 based on this broad-cutting CO2 scenario. This is what we were hoping for would have happened in the ocean. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so we have to look at some of the more dramatic emission scenarios where there is no significant mitigation effort put forward in carbon dioxide over the next few decades. And this is ultimately where we're likely headed, particularly given the atmosphere, the political atmosphere, and the failure of a lot of the international meetings that have not been successful in the past few years. And so under this RCP 8.5 scenario, we see the very dramatic difference between where we're going to be in the year 2100 in terms of pH change, where now the pH is going to be somewhere on the order of magnitude of 0.4 pH units less than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution, which is a very significant drop that's going to likely have quite a few impacts. And we do know from historical data that there have been times in the Earth's history when there's been very high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there have been high levels of CO2 in the ocean, and that the ocean has had a pH not unlike where we're headed by the end of this century if we don't make some significant changes. And we can use some geological proxy records to tell us what was going on in the ocean during those times. And so what I've plotted up for you here is some sediment core data. The colorful orange sort of brown sort of bar that you see on the middle of the slide is a sediment core that was taken out in the ocean, and it's overlaid on the left-hand side by a graph that shows the weight percent of calcium carbonate in the sediment. And so normally most sediment should have a significantly high concentration of this calcium carbonate, because all the organic matter that's produced in the ocean either gets consumed or respired in the ocean itself, or when it gets down to the sediments, it's broken down by the organisms that live in the sediment. So there's very little retention of organic carbon in the sediments. What mostly is preserved in the sediment is this calcium carbonate. So what you see throughout most of the history of this graph, going back about 55 million years, is that calcium carbonate weight percent in the sediment is up near about 100%, except during this excursion event that's shown in these gray highlights. And it was during this time that the ocean went through a period of having a very low pH and probably being acidic or more acidic than what it had been previously, so that it was probably very difficult for calcium carbonate organisms to survive and really thrive under those conditions. And you can see as a function of that, the weight percent of the carbonate in the sediments during this time dropped to near zero. So there was no calcium carbonate, or there was very little calcium carbonate being formed in most of the world's ocean, and so it wasn't being preserved in the sediment. And this is a very clear indication that there are times in the Earth's history where that calcium carbonate production can either be greatly reduced or in some places can actually shut off completely. And there were other physical changes associated with this acidification event. There was some extreme warming that was going on the planet, a 5 to 8 degree warming due to the additional carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere. There was the deoxygenation event in the ocean. The oceans lost oxygen. And there were obviously biological responses. There were large plankton blooms. The plant biomass in the ocean responded. They would do much better in a warmer, richer carbon dioxide environment. So these plankton blooms seemed to be more predominant. There were obviously mass extinction events. There was high species turnover, and obviously, as I said, there was changes in the rates of calcification around the ocean. But what's alarming is when we put this into our perspective of today's carbon dioxide emissions, our current rate of CO2 increases in the atmosphere and in the ocean is 10 times faster than it was 55 million years ago when this big excursion event happened, and then there was this major loss of calcium carbonate in the oceans. And so we are really, we've got this natural cycle of this natural process from this proxy record that is helping provide us with some understanding, but we also have to keep in mind that we are changing the atmosphere 10 times faster than it changed during this last excursion event, which tells us it's going to be even harder for a lot of the species to respond to the changes that they're facing. And so I have put a quote in here from a colleague of mine, Peter Brewer, and Peter said this at the Ocean and the High CO2 World that was held in Monterey, California last year. And Peter said that the outcome is very clear that we are in uncharted territory in the entire span of Earth's history. The primary cause of this is simply the rate of change. We are changing Earth far, far faster than any recorded geological shift ever. And I think that is a great quote, and I think a lot of you probably know Peter Brewer as somebody who's been around for a long time and really has some great insights into these kind of things. And so for Peter to come out and say something this strongly tells us that I think we need to consider this as a very serious problem. And so we want to know why is this worse in some places and in others. And because I have a sort of Pacific or Alaska-centric focus, what I'm going to really talk about for the rest of these slides is why the North Pacific and Alaska are more vulnerable to ocean acidification. and it really relates back to the circulation of water around the planet. What I've plotted for you up here, or showing for you up here in the top left-hand corner, is a figure from Dick Feely's 2004 paper that shows the depth of the saturation horizon for aragonite. And aragonite is one of the two important carbonate minerals that we're very concerned about. And what this plot shows is the depth in the ocean at which this aragonite naturally becomes undersaturated. And so we think of it in two ways. We think of the water being saturated with these carbonate minerals, which means that the calcifying organisms have plenty of the calcium carbonate to use to build and maintain their shells. And we think about the water being undersaturated in these carbonate minerals, which are going to make it much harder for the shells to be maintained, particularly in the early life stages. And these organisms can actually start to dissolve when they are exposed to waters that are undersaturated in the predominant carbonate mineral that their shells are constructed in. So this plot here shows you, the figure shows you the depth in the ocean at which the water goes from being supersaturated to being undersaturated. And in the North Atlantic Ocean, over on the Atlantic side, the saturation depth is very deep, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 meters deep in the water column in the Atlantic Ocean. But what happens is the water circulates around the planet in this sort of conveyor belt that we conceptualize. It moves from the North Pacific around through the Indian Ocean, and it makes its way through the Pacific until it winds up in the North Pacific, and particularly along the western coast of North America. And here it's upwelled to the surface. It's just naturally moved from deeper in the ocean to the surface, and that makes the saturation horizon shoal. That means it comes up very near the surface. And so you can see from this plot, particularly off of Alaska and off the west coast, the saturation horizon for aragonite is only a few hundred meters deep, and in some cases only about 100 meters deep. So that means that this water in the North Pacific, near Alaska, and off the west coast of North America is preconditioned to have low pH and low saturation states. And so it's not going to take a lot of additional anthropogenic CO2 to be added into these waters to push them past that threshold where they're ultimately going to become undersaturated in these carbonate minerals. And so I have another little video to show you here. And what this shows, in the upper part of the plot here, you see the year, and it starts in 1765, and it's going to go forward. And what you're going to see in the color, it's scaled in the white bar to the left-hand side, is the aragonite saturation state. And so the blues and the purples mean that saturation states are high and that organisms would be fine. As it approaches the oranges and the reds, it passes the threshold of 1. And 1 is where we think of being supersaturated versus being undersaturated. And you see, as we move through time, we're now in the year 2050 or into 2070, you can see what's happened around the planet. All those blues and all those purples are being replaced by yellows and oranges and reds as the CO2 accumulates in the ocean and the saturation state of aragonite starts becoming closer and closer to this threshold of 1 that we're concerned about. And so if we keep playing this forward, this is going to stop in the year 2100. You can see what's happening around the planet. I'm going to play this again forward now, and it's just going to show the saturation state for the Pacific Ocean with no rotation of the Earth. And so this is going to really show you why we're concerned about Alaska and why we're concerned about the Pacific west coast of North America. And you can see even 100 years ago, we were starting to see changes in the saturation state for aragonite. And now, as we're getting closer to the present, you can see the changes in the northern Pacific and the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea that have started to occur, and that is going to progressively get worse as time goes on. So that by the year 2100, the entire North Pacific, the Gulf of Alaska, the Bering Sea, the Arctic Ocean, and maybe even some parts of the west coast of North America will be perennially undersaturated in aragonite. Those concentrations will be, the saturation states will be less than 1 year-round, and that will get particularly worse the higher north you go. The northern latitudes are even more susceptible. So places like the Bering Sea and the Arctic, that transition will happen first, sometime probably likely around mid-century, around 2050 or 2060, with the rest of the North Pacific region following behind that, so that by the year 2100, the entire North Pacific Basin will likely be undersaturated in aragonite. And so if we look at some specific examples of what's going on now, we go up into Alaska, in the northern Gulf of Alaska. We've had the opportunity to do some time series work where we've gone out and we've occupied the same oceanographic stations a number of times throughout the year. So what I'm showing you in the left-hand column is observations that were made in May of 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011. And then on the right-hand column, these are observations in September of 2008, 2009, 2010, and 2011. And this is, again, aragonite saturation state. And just to make sure that you're good and confused, the color bar has now flipped. So now the blues and the purples are undersaturated in aragonite, and the oranges and the red have higher aragonite saturation states. And so there's something going on here in the Gulf of Alaska that's also observed off the west coast of North America, and that's at certain times of the year, the deeper waters from offshore that are richer in carbon dioxide and have lower pH and lower saturation state are upwelled onto the continental shelf. And so you're looking at the water column here. This is 0 starting up at the top of each graph and then going to 300 meters down at the bottom of each graph. And this extends out where the RB stands for Resurrection Bay, which is an inshore estuary just close to the town of Seward. And then out to the 13 means you're going further and further offshore. And if you look at these data, you see that in May, most of that water that's undersaturated in aragonite, the blues and the purples, are off the continental shelf. They're out sort of in the Gulf of Alaska where they're not really being exposed, or they're not up, having any impact on the organisms that are living near the bottom on the continental shelf. But what happens in September is these upwelling events start to occur, so that you see the big change is that in September, when we come back, the broad areas of all the bottom waters of the inner part of the shelf are undersaturated now in aragonite, and that saturation horizon creeps up to less than 100 meters from the surface. So any benthic calcifying organisms, things like clams, oysters, crabs, anything that lives near the bottom, are now being exposed to this water that's undersaturated in aragonite for at least a few months every year, and we put some mooring, we put a mooring out in this very location to try to quantify how long these events last. But we know at the very least, for several months a year, this part of the shelf is undersaturated in aragonite near the bottom. So that's upwelling that's doing that near the bottom. At the surface, for the first time in 2011, we observed aragonite undersaturations at the surface. And so what we think is causing that is the increased amount of glacial discharge. Because of all the melting glaciers in Alaska, the glacial meltwater has very low saturation state. It doesn't have a lot of total alkalinity in the glacial meltwater. And alkalinity is the natural buffering capacity of the ocean against pH change. So the more you dilute that total alkalinity, the lower the buffering capacity and the lower the saturation state will ultimately be. And so in September of 2011, we found this big plume of glacial meltwater out over the continental shelf of the Gulf of Alaska. And we did find, and I plotted it here on these figures over to the right-hand side, is that aragonite was undersaturated at the surface at several of these locations due to this glacial meltwater. If we switch to the Bering Sea, which is obviously highly productive, the very important crab fishery in the Bering Sea, we see another process that's going on in the Bering Sea, and that's that the biological pump is really forcing the bottom waters of the Bering Sea to become undersaturated in aragonite. So there's not upwelling in the Bering Sea like there is in the Gulf of Alaska. But what I plotted for you here is, again, saturation states of aragonite in the water column over the Bering Sea. And what you see is a very clear delineation between what's going on at the surface, where there's these greens and oranges, and what's going on in the subsurface waters from 40 meters down to the bottom, where it's purple and blue and undersaturated in aragonite. And so what happens every year is there's a big biological bloom of phytoplankton in the surface ocean. And that phytoplankton, which are basically plants in the ocean, consume carbon dioxide, they remove it from the water, and they form organic matter. And so that's really anti-ocean acidification going on up here at the surface. They're reducing the CO2 concentrations, which make pH go up and saturation states go up. But all that organic matter that gets produced sinks down into the deeper water where it's respired, it's broken down, and that organic matter is turned back into carbon dioxide. And so you see the impact that has. The adding that CO2 to the bottom water drives the pH to be very low, and it drives aragonite to become undersaturated in very broad areas across the shelf of the Bering Sea. And the interesting thing is that if you subtract out the amount of anthropogenic CO2 that's already in this water, a lot of these undersaturations do go away. So we do see that there's a significant influence of the anthropogenic CO2 it's already having on these continental shelf systems. And so we wanted to quantify how long these high CO2 conditions or the undersaturated conditions persist over this part of the Bering Sea shelf. So we did put a mooring in, and we put a sensor down near the bottom that measured carbon dioxide and oxygen. And so that's what I plotted for you here on the graph now near the bottom. This is May the 14th through October the 5th of 2012. And the red dots are carbon dioxide levels, which are scaled over on the right-hand side. And the blue data is oxygen that's scaled on the left-hand side. And you can see they're inversely related. As carbon dioxide goes up, oxygen goes down. And so this is the natural respiration process that's going on. But you can see that CO2 levels reach as high as 1,500 microatmospheres in the fall and going into the September and October time frame. And so this is that buildup of CO2 from respiration. And the lines that I put, the dashed lines, is we think that any time carbon dioxide levels on this part of the Bering Sea shelf get above about 500 microatmospheres, aragonite becomes undersaturated. So if you look from about the end of May all the way through the time we picked up the sensor at the beginning of October, CO2 levels were higher than that 500 microatmosphere threshold. So we're pretty confident for this 4 or 5 month period that this sensor set in the water that aragonite was undersaturated over this part of the Bering Sea shelf. And then obviously we can confirm that with our oxygen sensor. So we do know that the Bering Sea is definitely heading in a direction to being both undersaturated seasonally, with those undersaturations expanding and becoming more intense. Finally, if we move up into the Arctic Ocean, we see a similar trend. This is up on the Beaufort Sea shelf, which is north of Alaska. We also see big upwelling events that push the high CO2 water that is low in aragonite saturation states up on the continental shelf during the storm events. And we also have another problem in Alaska. Much like the Gulf of Alaska with the glacial discharge, the Arctic has a sea ice problem. So the more the sea ice melts, the more it dilutes the saturation state of these carbonate minerals. And so if we look at the difference between what was going on in 1997 and 2008, we're starting to see broad patches of surface water undersaturation in aragonite because of this ice melt. And I'm sure everyone is very familiar by now with the extensive ice loss that's occurring during the summertime in the Arctic Ocean. Areas that had always had ice cover, were perennially ice covered going back thousands of years, are now melting back and are exposed to both the atmosphere and the dilution effect that this meltwater from the ice provides. And so the Arctic has a double threat from both the increased upwelling that we're seeing because of the loss of ice, and also from the dilution of alkalinity from the ice loss itself. And so if we think about this in terms of the impacts to marine organisms, there's a whole laundry list of things that have been proposed, and many of them have been confirmed in terms of the ecosystem impact. Things like reduced calcification rate, shift in diversity in different organisms, changes in the fitness and survival of organisms as they're exposed to these ocean acidification conditions. And so we really have to look at them on a species by species basis, because there is no really magic key to unlocking our understanding to this. We have to look at it at a very specific level. And so the ground zero species for ocean acidification really seems to be the pteropod, which is a tiny little zooplankton. And I've got a little video here that I'm going to play for you. This is what one looks like. And they're about the size of a small fingernail. You can see them with your eyes, but they're relatively small. That's one swimming in a beaker. But these poor guys are very sensitive to aragonite. Most of their shell structure is made up of aragonite. So that means when they get into conditions where CO2 is high, and the saturation for aragonite is low, they start to dissolve very quickly. And so this is a picture of what a pteropod shell looks like after it's been exposed to aragonite under saturated conditions at CO2 levels of around 1,100 parts per million, which, remember, I told you at the very first slide, that's about the level that we're headed to by the end of this century. When this guy was incubated in these conditions for 29 days, you can see almost a complete dissolution of the shell. And now, for the first time, these shell dissolutions have actually been observed in the environment. And so we have a postdoc working here now at PMEL has done some really cutting-edge work on this, and she's shown some observations down in the Southern Ocean where she's found patches of ocean water that, because ocean acidification has caused the aragonite to become undersaturated, she has found pteropods in the environment who are showing very, very clear signs of shell dissolution. Another species that seems to be particularly sensitive are coccolithophores. Coccolithophores are another microscopic organism that do fill a pretty important niche in the ecosystem. And so this is how two species of these coccolithophores respond to high CO2 levels. The pictures on the left-hand side show you what these coccoliths look like at sort of normal CO2 levels, 280 to 380 parts per million. But this is what starts to happen to them when they're exposed to higher CO2 levels. You see a very sharp increase in their calcification rate, and in some cases you see the shells almost completely begin to fall apart. And so if we put this into a food web perspective, the coccolithophores and the pteropods both really form the basis of the food web for organisms like the pink salmon. And so you can see very clearly that any loss or change in the base of this food web structure could have cascading impacts up into the higher trophic levels and the commercially important species that we rely on. And a very good example of that is the fact that for Alaska pink salmon, or pink salmon in general, the juvenile salmon, while they're out in the ocean, about 45% of their diet is made up of pteropods. And so this early study by Aiden in 2005 did show that a 10% decrease in pteropod production could lead to a 20% drop in mature salmon body weight. And so there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done on this to quantify what the impact on pteropods are going to be and what their connectivity is to the salmon. This is a very alarming trend that shows us that a loss of a keystone species like the pteropod could have a pretty important consequence to a commercially important species that we rely on. A couple of other species that seem to be at risk. Clams also seem to struggle, particularly at the larval and juvenile stage. This is a clam exposed to aragonite concentrations of about 0.5. These are conditions that we're observing now today in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea and the Arctic. You can see after 72 hours of exposure to these levels, the clam shell starts to dissolve pretty rapidly. Another species that has gotten quite a bit of public attention, particularly on the West Coast, is the failure in the oyster hatcheries that have occurred, particularly the larval oysters, where there was a major loss, and those industries nearly went out of business because they were inadvertently pumping water that was undersaturated in aragonite up into their hatcheries during these ocean acidification events or these upwelling events. But fortunately, they've got some monitoring programs going on now that are allowing them to alleviate this. But that's a Band-Aid solution. Over time, as the CO2 continues to increase, the amount of times that they're able to pump water into their hatchery are going to decrease. From a marine primary productivity standpoint, as we saw in that slide that I showed you with the sediment core, there is going to be productivity in the ocean. It's just we may not understand or we may not have a commercial use for what's going to wind up being the dominant species under a higher CO2, warmer environmental conditions. And so obviously the plant biomass in the ocean is going to love those warmer, higher CO2 conditions. And so we have some very good examples of this already. There are natural CO2 vent systems, particularly there's one location off of Italy where there's a natural CO2 vent. And in this region, there's a tremendous amount of seagrass and not much else that grows. And so you can see that if these grasses and these other primary producers start to choke out other aspects of the ecosystem, that can have very significant consequences. The final impact that we particularly think about up in Alaska and also along the West Coast is that during ocean acidification events, harmful algal blooms also tend to increase. They seem to do better under the higher CO2 conditions. This is a study done very recently that showed in these harmful algal blooms, the domic acid, which is the actual toxic compound that's found in the harmful algal blooms, increases by quite a bit at the higher CO2 levels. So you can see the black and the red and the green. The green is at 760 parts per million CO2, with that domic acid concentration being much higher. So this is just yet another impact to think about. We also need to think about loss of species, both diversity and mutations that are going on. There's another recent paper that's just come out that's shown that there are two things that can happen under rising CO2 levels. Either one genome type can become dominant and you have a loss of diversity, which is shown in the top part of this graph. And on the bottom part, you actually have mutations from one genotype to another genotype, with unknown consequences, obviously, of how that will cascade through the ecosystem. Finally, if we look at two specific effects on the fisheries, particularly in Alaska, and this is what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, two recent studies by a group up in Kodiak, the NOAA Fisheries Lab up there, have shown that particularly for the king crab up in Alaska, there is a decrease in survival rate and hatch success under higher CO2 conditions. And there's also changes in the carbonate structure of the shell. So there's a clear response of this commercially important organism, the negative response to the organisms under higher CO2 conditions. On the other hand, a pelagic fish species, a pollock, which is also very important to the Alaska regional economy, seems to not be particularly impacted by ocean acidification. So I've been involved with two studies that have been led by Tom Hurst at the Hatfield Lab in Newport, Oregon, where we did some intermediate term incubations to both larval and juvenile pollock, and the pollock didn't seem to mind all that much. There was really no physiological change in the pollock under the CO2 or higher CO2 conditions. So again, this brings us back to the point of we're going to have to understand very carefully on a species by species basis of what these impacts are going to be from ocean acidification. And as I said, just to summarize, we've got people food to consider that we need to think about in terms of the impact. We've got fish food, things like the pteropod, these keystone organisms, and then finally the ecosystem response as a whole. So this is going to be a very complicated picture going forward, and we've still got a great deal of work to understand the intricacies and the interconnectivity of how all of this is going to play out. And this is another great quote that I like to show, particularly to summarize up this discussion, is that some species will decline, others will increase with the net loss of biodiversity. The ocean is always going to be productive. There's always going to be biological productivity in the ocean. It just might change. And a colleague of mine named Beth Fulton, I think, summed it up best when she said, we will still have fisheries if we're willing to eat different fish. And that's what we need to think about in terms of our marine resources going forward. So finally, we've got a number of monitoring efforts that are going on. Obviously, the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program is building a global OA network to deal with these challenges, and we're working with our partners around the globe to get different monitoring sites up. We've started an enhanced monitoring program up in Alaska, and so this map shows you the 5 sites where we're going to be monitoring ocean acidification in real time around the state. And so I've got a picture here of the ocean acidification mooring that's now just outside of Resurrection Bay, close to Seward, where we're measuring carbon dioxide and pH and then all the other biogeochemical parameters that we ultimately hope will tell us about those seasonal cycles and then the longer-term trends that are going on in ocean acidification. And we hope to synthesize all this data into what we're calling a vulnerability index. And so we're well underway in doing this. We're hoping to publish this later this year for Alaska. And what we've done is we've really looked at the communities on a community-by-community basis to see what their resiliency is and what their vulnerability would be due to ocean acidification in Alaska. And so we've broken it down on things like commercial harvest, subsistence fisheries, the viability of the economies and the diversity of the economies in these different communities that if somebody had to stop fishing because of a loss of a fishery from ocean acidification, are there other livelihoods or other careers that those people could go into? And it has given us this index. And you can see all of western Alaska has a very low resiliency index, either native communities that rely on subsistence fisheries, or these are commercially centric regions or commercially fishery-centric regions that could not deal effectively with a major loss of fisheries due to ocean acidification. And so we're continuing to work on these types of things, which is ultimately going to bring us back to that economic question of how ocean acidification is going to affect the lives of people both in Alaska and around the country. And so finally, I want to leave you with a slide that a colleague of mine, Joni Klepp, has come up with. And I think it's a great analogy for the ocean acidification discussion. And I really put in, and no offense to any smokers that are out there, but you have to think about ocean acidification in terms of smoking. That smoking causes multiple health issues in the body. But until the smoker will kick that habit, all you can do is treat the symptoms of smoking and ask the patient to eliminate other stressors such as drinking and eating poorly or getting more exercise. Well, we think about ocean acidification in the very same way. The ocean acidification problem is caused by carbon dioxide. And so until we're ready to kick that CO2 habit, we are not going to change this trajectory that we are on for the ocean becoming more acidic. But what we can do is we can treat the other symptoms. We can alleviate other stresses in the oceans, things like pollution and overfishing, to help these ecosystems survive and continue to support both our subsistence communities and our commercial communities until a time that we can find an alternative energy source that will allow us to start to bring down these CO2 concentrations. And so at the beginning of the slide, I sort of posed the question of is the sky falling? And I think the answer is not yet, but we do know that there's a major catastrophic event that could be coming if we don't implement changes. We've seen from our historical proxies that there have been times in the ocean where calcification has been greatly reduced or has stopped completely, and we definitely don't want to get to that point. A loss of our coral reef systems, a loss of our calcifying organism fisheries, things like crabs and clams and oysters would have very dramatic impacts to a number of communities both around the country and around the world. Unfortunately, we are still not at the point where we can predict what these exact costs would be or the casualties that are going to be associated with them, but we do know how to prevent them. Like I just said in the previous slide, we have to think about short-term adaptation strategies. In the near term, what can we do to alleviate the stresses on our ecosystem while at the same time working towards those long-term structural changes in our energy policy that are going to get us off of CO2 and get us out of the business of fundamentally changing both the atmosphere and the oceans because of those emissions. So finally, I just want to wrap up before I take any questions. I want to thank a long list of financial supporters who have supported this, all the federal agencies, NSF, NASA, the NOAA, the Alaska Ocean Observing System, the North Pacific Research Board, and then a number of smaller agencies that have come in. The Alaska State Legislature has provided a great deal of support that allowed us to build this ocean acidification monitoring network. And I certainly want to thank Dick Feely and Chris Sabine and all the rest of my colleagues around the world who are contributing this. You know, everything that I showed you today has been a cumulative effort over years and decades with people who have been working for a very long time to understand this. And then I certainly want to thank the research staff and my graduate students at PMEL and at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Jim, and hopefully we can do some question and answers in the last 10 minutes that we have.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. An excellent presentation with lots of things to think about. There are some questions rolling in, and folks, if you have questions, type them into the question box. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm going to try to summarize this one. There's sort of a lengthy almost discussion type question, but I think I can summarize it down to a succinct question. That is, you referred to Resurrection Bay a few times in your presentation as a place we've done some sampling. One of our questioners would like to know about the fact that there is coal that's exported out of Seward. There's an indication that there's meters deep coal debris at the head of Resurrection Bay, underneath the coal conveyor, and that there's a lot of coal dust that blows into the bay, on the order of thousands of tons. Could this be affecting the pH locally, and could it be affecting some of the sampling that goes on in Resurrection Bay?
Well, that's a great question. We certainly don't think that the coal that's sitting at the bottom of Resurrection Bay is impacting. That's not a direct cause of ocean acidification. So it's not impacting our sampling. The coal dust that's blowing in could have some localized effect on pH. We're not seeing evidence of that, or at least I don't think we're seeing evidence of that. But I would say that that's one of those other stressors that I think we need to be concerned about, is that coal dust blowing into Resurrection Bay is not really exacerbating ocean acidification itself in Resurrection Bay, but it's another potential stressor that's entering that ecosystem that those organisms are having to deal with. Now, from the broader perspective, all that coal is going to wind up being burned and releasing CO2 in the atmosphere. So the byproduct of that coal burning is, I think, what we need to be most concerned with in terms of the ocean acidification impacts.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Another question here says, I'm concerned about Pacific walruses, which feed largely on benthic bivalves in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. What recent studies are there exploring potential adverse effect on walruses from ocean acidification?
So another very good question. I'm sitting in my office at PMER right now, and literally upstairs from me, Jackie Grebmeyer is leading a workshop on what's called the Distributed Biological Observatory, the DBO. And what they're doing is they're establishing a number of sites in the Arctic Ocean that are going to look at just that very question of how organisms like the walrus are being impacted by the changing benthic environment that's happening in the Chukchi Sea. And one very important aspect of that is going to be to understand how ocean acidification is changing those bivalves, the habitat that those bivalves have historically existed in, and what potential impacts they will be. So I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, but that is certainly something that we are concerned about, given the importance that those bivalves play in the diet of those walrus.
Thank you. Another question here says, are there any recent studies that look at impacts of increased ocean acidification already occurring or likely to occur on jellyfish? Any impacts from ocean acidification on jellyfish?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if anybody is looking at jellyfish specifically. Off the top of my head, jellies, obviously being a non-calcifying organism, my first impression wouldn't be that there would be a huge red flag for them. But like I said, with all of these species, we're almost going to have to do it on a species-by-species basis. So I don't know about the jellyfish question, but I can certainly find out. And Jim, if you'll send me whoever asked that question, I can certainly send them an email later on if I find anything.
Sure, we can do that. Another question, you referred to an increase in temperature and acidification some 55 million years ago. Any clue as to what the cause of that increase in acidification was?
There's a great deal of debate that surrounds that. We do know that there was a major CO2 excursion event at that time, at that 55 million year threshold. We don't know exactly what caused it. It could have been a major release of methane hydrates around the planet. The jury is still out on the exact cause of where all that CO2 came from. We just know that CO2 in the atmosphere went up very quickly over that time frame, but we do know that it went up slower than it is today, and that's the point that I made, is we're increasing our CO2 levels 10 times faster today than during that last major CO2 excursion event. So I can't give you a good answer on where all that CO2 came from. We just know that it ended up in the atmosphere and it changed the carbonate chemistry of the ocean that led to that previous ocean acidification event.
Okay, we've got a few more here. I'll try to squeeze them in. Do you have a few more minutes? It is 1 o'clock, Jeremy, and I know...
Absolutely. I can go and tell people there's
okay, great. So here's a few more. This one's more of a comment than a question. It says, the suggestion that smokers should not be offended by being compared to increasing atmospheric CO2 is pretty striking. So I don't know if we're... so that's a comment. Somebody has this question. You showed juvenile pollock flourishing under increased CO2 conditions. What do pollock eat, or what were they being fed in the study?
Well, I don't think we would use the word that they flourish under ocean acidification conditions. I think we would say that they were non-responsive to ocean acidification conditions. So we need to be careful. It's certainly ocean acidification is not going to be good for them. It's just that they don't seem to be directly impacted. Now, the thing that we didn't do in that study was look at the prey sources for pollock. So if we were feeding the pollock, they were fat and happy while we were exposing them to higher CO2 conditions. The more complex ecosystem question is now, what are pollock eating, and are those species then at risk to some ocean acidification impact? So we're not quite done. The point that I was trying to make with that is just from the direct impact, the crabs seem to do have a direct response to ocean acidification, while a fish species like a pollock does not.
Okay, thank you. In the slide entitled Trends in Ocean Acidification, there was a figure, courtesy of Jim Orr, showing long-term temporal changes in seawater pH, the one that started at the Industrial Revolution. Where did this reconstruction come from, and how many of these types of data sets do we have to gauge how representative and accurate these reconstructions are of large-scale trends in the ocean?
I think that figure in particular came from Jim Orr's got several publications where he's shown those figures. It comes from, the data basically comes from CO2 records that are taken out of ice cores. And so whether they be from Greenland or Antarctica, we can go back thousands of years in the ice core records and see where CO2 levels were in the atmosphere. And because we know that for the most part, the atmospheric CO2 concentrations are in sync with the ocean CO2 concentrations, we can back calculate those pH values under those different atmospheric conditions. And so I would say we were very confident in our ability at least to predict back to that 1850 time frame of what pH was and how it has changed as atmospheric CO2 has risen. So I would encourage anybody that's interested in more than that to take a look at some of the publications that Jim Orr has put out.
Okay, great. This one is really a question for me, I guess. It says, what is the POET group doing to communicate this research to local communities? Well, this webinar is one example. This is not just an NPS-centric webinar, but it's put out through a lot of local community announcements, and I know that some folks from our local community are tuned into this webinar. But really, if you would like to send me an email, I can certainly give you more information about other efforts we're doing through web outreach and through these kind of webinars and so forth to get this information out. Here's another one specific to Resurrection Bay. Considering the available data, how long or what's the indication for when the shellfish hatchery's water supply could be of concern to their spats productivity? So there is a shellfish hatchery right here in Resurrection Bay. Do they need to be concerned now or in the immediate future, or when, about the acidity in Resurrection Bay?
That's a great question, and we have just made contact with the owners and operators of that hatchery in Resurrection Bay, and we're going to install CO2 and pH monitoring on their intake lines this year, in the next few months actually. And so the short answer is yes, I think they should be concerned, given what we've seen in the hatcheries down along the West Coast and Washington and Oregon. We reached out to them and asked them if they wanted to go ahead and start a robust monitoring program that look at their intake waters so that we can help them prepare for the challenges. Because while we don't see conditions in Resurrection Bay now that would be potentially harmful, like what was observed on the West Coast in Oregon and Washington, we do know that the trend is heading in that direction. So I think the earlier we can start those monitoring programs, the more flexibility and the greater response time that those industries will be able to have.
Okay, here's another one. Since the impacts of ocean acidification seem to be greater in the Pacific, does the Pacific serve as a case study or indicator for future impacts to the Atlantic species?
It absolutely does. And we actually think of the Arctic Ocean as being the bellwether or the canary in the coal mine. The Arctic Ocean will probably go first or be one of the oceans that goes undersaturated first. with respect to aragonite. And so the studies we're doing up in the Arctic and even into the Bering Sea are going to provide us with those early insights of how the global ocean will respond to the changes. So unfortunately, Alaska, the oceans around Alaska are really the tip of the spear in terms of ocean acidification impacts. And so that's why we're putting so much effort and emphasis into doing that work up there.
Okay, I have just two more questions. I'm going to cut it off at that. It looks like the last two on the list, so if you've got one in your mind now, just hold on to it because we got to let Jeremy go. But the first one says, are we able to access the Lobeck article on evolution and ocean acidification that you referenced?
The Globeck article on ocean acidification. Yes, everything I showed is referenced in these slides. So as long as you have access to the internet, you should be able to find all this material online.
And this, again, the webinar will be recorded. I hope to get it posted soon on the Ocean Alaska Science and Learning Center website. And was that a Globeck article?
I'm not sure what they're referring to when they say Globeck.
Okay,
article.
so they actually said Lobeck, like it's a name maybe? I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, the Lobeck article, yes. That Globeck is a program that ran several years ago. But yes, the Lobeck article is certainly available.
Is that something that like a Google Scholar search might turn up fairly?
Yes, they might have to. They might either have to go to a library to access it if the journal normally charges you to access it. So unless you can go to a university that has access to the journal, or just go to a library. Most libraries have subscriptions to those journals, and you should be able to use Google Scholar, and it should pop right up.
Okay, so it sounds like not something immediately accessible perhaps, but and not accessible through the POET website or anything that I'm aware of. Okay, and finally, what top 3 individual or community actions would you recommend to audiences that you're talking to give them a sense of hope and something tangible they can do about the challenge of reducing emissions?
Sure. Well, that's number one is everybody can take some personal responsibility in reducing their carbon footprint. Like I said, CO2 is the problem, so the more CO2 you can reduce in your daily life, the better. You can encourage your legislators and your representatives to consider funding this work and also to move towards national, international action in terms of CO2 mitigation efforts. That we've got to have the political will. Right now we don't, and so nothing is going to change until we move our representatives in that direction. And finally, is along with the CO2 reduction, reduce your additional stressors that you put onto the ecosystems. So pollution levels. There's been great programs I know down in Homer where they had the throttle back program where they encourage fishermen to slow down just a little bit, throttle back to save that gasoline and save that CO2 from winding up in the atmosphere. So I don't want to leave it on a doom and gloom note. Like I said at the end, we're not there yet in terms of significant impacts to the ecosystem. There's still time to do something about it, and we can still manage our way through this. People just have to understand what's going on and encourage their representatives to weigh into this problem, and let's get something done about it.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Jeremy, for spending more than an hour with us today, and it was excellent information. We had a good attendance of some 75 folks listening in, so despite the fact that it may seem sort of lonely and empty in your office, there were a lot of folks out there listening in.
Well, I certainly appreciate everybody that took an hour out of their day to join us.
All right. Well, and we'll do this again next month. We'll have another webinar that'll feature an update on marine debris in the North Pacific, another cheery topic to share with everyone, but hope to have you tuned in then. Look on your email for a registration link for that. All righty. And with that, we'll wrap it up and end the webinar.